A tense courtroom, a smirking judge, and a confident teen standing alone. He was just 19, facing charges everyone thought would ruin his life. The judge smirked. The prosecutor laughed. The evidence? A slam dunk. But then he did the impossible. Ethan, confidently pointing to documents, courtroom gasping with nothing but his voice and knowledge. He turned the entire case upside down. And what happened next? Left the courtroom speechless. Watched till the end to see how this teen genius shocked the entire legal system. Text on screen, "You won't believe how he won." The courtroom buzzed with murmurs as Ethan Carter, just 19 years old, stood before the judge. His future hung in the balance, and everyone in the packed gallery seemed convinced of the outcome before the trial even began. The prosecutor, Margaret Hayes, shuffled papers with the smugness of someone who thought the case was already won. The bailiff, Tom Reynolds, leaned against the wall, uninterested, as if this was just another young man about to get chewed up by the system. At the bench, Judge Philip Donovan leaned back in his chair with a smirk tugging at the corners of his lips. He looked down at Ethan as though the boy was wasting his time. "Mr. Carter," the judge drawled, "you understand the charges against you, don't you?" His tone was laced with mockery, almost daring Ethan to respond. The charges were serious: possession, intent to distribute, and resisting arrest. If convicted, Ethan could face years behind bars. His court-appointed attorney had withdrawn last minute, leaving him to stand alone. Most people in his situation would have folded under the pressure, but Ethan wasn't most people. Taking a deep breath, he raised his chin. "Yes, Your Honor," he said clearly, his voice steady despite the weight pressing on his chest. "And I'll be representing myself." A ripple of laughter spread through the courtroom. Margaret chuckled openly. "Your Honor, surely this is a waste of the court's time. The boy has no training. He'll sink himself in 5 minutes. Judge Donovan's smirk grew wider. "If he wants to make a fool of himself, I say let him." But as Ethan picked up the case file, flipping through it with sharp eyes, there was a flicker of something in his gaze, calm, calculated, and far from foolish. The courtroom had no idea what was about to hit them. Ethan Carter felt the weight of every eye in the courtroom on him, but he didn't flinch. He knew that the only way to survive this trial was to stay calm, think clearly, and strike when the moment was right. Margaret Hayes had laid out her opening statement like she already owned the verdict. Every word she spoke seemed designed to crush him before he could even speak. "As you can see, Your Honor," Margaret said, pointing to a series of photographs and documents, "the defendant was caught red-handed. The evidence is clear. There is no reasonable doubt." Tom Reynolds, the bailiff, shuffled his feet, clearly bored, but Ethan caught the subtle smirk on his face. Even the court reporter seemed tense, sensing that something unusual was about to unfold. Ethan's heart raced, but he forced himself to breathe slowly. He had spent weeks studying the law, memorizing precedents, and practicing every argument he could imagine. He had no intention of letting age, inexperience, or the mockery of Judge Donovan dictate the outcome. When the judge nodded for him to speak, Ethan rose, voice steady, eyes locked on Margaret. "Your Honor," he began, "before we go any further, I would like to challenge the validity of the search that led to the evidence being presented." Laughter rippled through the courtroom. "Oh, this should be good," someone muttered from the gallery. Judge Donovan raised an eyebrow. "Go on, Mr. Carter. Enlighten us." Ethan laid out his argument with precision, citing cases and legal technicalities that even Margaret seemed unprepared for. Each point he made was met with silence, then subtle shifts of unease. He could feel the room tense. For the first time, the prosecutor's confident smile faltered. By the time he finished, Judge Donovan leaned forward, frowning. Ethan didn't just speak, he controlled the courtroom. Something told him this was only the beginning. The courtroom had changed. Where moments ago there was laughter and dismissive smirks, now there was tension. Ethan Carter's calm, precise arguments had thrown Margaret Hayes off balance. Even Judge Donovan, who rarely revealed any surprise, furrowed his brow, flipping through the case files with renewed scrutiny. Margaret's voice, once confident and commanding, now carried a hint of doubt. "Your Honor, the evidence is still clear. The defendant was found in possession," she began, but Ethan interrupted. "Objection, Your Honor," he said, standing tall. His voice didn't waver. "The evidence was obtained without a proper warrant. The chain of custody is incomplete, and several procedures were violated according to precedent. A murmur ran through the gallery. People exchanged glances. At 19, Ethan was dismantling the prosecution's case piece by piece. The courtroom atmosphere shifted from amusement to disbelief. Judge Donovan leaned forward. "Mr. Carter," he said cautiously, "are you asserting that you're aware of legal precedents sufficient to challenge this evidence?" Ethan nodded. "Yes, Your Honor. I've studied prior rulings extensively. This case contains multiple procedural errors that could render the evidence inadmissible." Margaret's hand trembled slightly as she rifled through her notes, searching for a counter. The confidence that had dominated the first hour was gone. Ethan noticed the subtle signs, the flick of her eyes, the hesitance in her tone. He had managed to do what no one expected, make the prosecution question itself in front of the judge. Tom Reynolds, the bailiff, shifted uncomfortably, sensing that the young man standing before them wasn't just defending himself. He was taking control of the courtroom. Judge Donovan's eyes narrowed. He had seen inexperienced defendants stumble, cry, beg, but Ethan Carter, he was different, and for the first time that day, the judge realized that this trial was no longer just another routine case. The battle had begun, and Ethan was holding the upper hand. Ethan Carter could feel the shift in the courtroom. Every eye was on him now, not with amusement, but with curiosity and a growing sense of tension. Margaret Hayes, once brimming with confidence, was now frantically flipping through documents, muttering to herself. Even Judge Donovan, who rarely showed emotion, appeared cautious, his smirk replaced with a measured frown. Ethan cleared his throat, his voice calm but commanding. "Your Honor, I'd like to call attention to a key inconsistency in the witness statements," he said, walking slowly toward the evidence table. He gestured toward a series of police reports. According to the official documentation, the timeline of the alleged arrest contradicts the statements given by Officer Langley. These discrepancies raise serious questions about credibility and procedure. A murmur ran through the courtroom. Margaret's lips pressed into a thin line. She had anticipated challenges to the evidence, but she had not expected this level of analysis from someone so young. Judge Donovan leaned forward, intrigued despite himself. "Explain this further, Mr. Carter," he said, his tone neutral but sharp. Ethan did. He cited statutes, referenced prior cases, and highlighted procedural errors with precision. Each point struck like a hammer, slowly dismantling the prosecution's seemingly airtight case. He wasn't just defending himself, he was teaching the courtroom, forcing them to see the flaws in a system that had underestimated him. The gallery was silent, captivated. Even Tom Reynolds, the bailiff, stopped shifting, his arms crossed as he watched Ethan command the room. Margaret finally spoke, her voice strained. "Your Honor, the defendant is stretching the interpretation." Judge Donovan raised a hand, cutting her off. "I am listening, Miss Hayes, but I must say, Mr. Carter's points warrant consideration." Ethan returned to his seat, eyes steady, knowing he had made the first real dent in the prosecution's armor. The courtroom that had mocked him was now watching, waiting, and unsure of what would happen next. For the first time, Ethan sensed that victory wasn't impossible, it was within reach. The atmosphere in the courtroom had changed completely. Whispers filled the gallery as spectators exchanged astonished glances. Ethan Carter, the 19-year-old defendant, was no longer just a boy facing serious charges. He was now the center of attention, commanding respect through sheer intelligence and composure. Judge Donovan leaned back slightly, his frown deepening. He had seen many inexperienced defendants stumble, but Ethan's methodical approach, precise citations, and unwavering confidence was something entirely different. He glanced at Margaret Hayes, whose earlier smugness had vanished completely. She was struggling to find a way to regain control of a trial that was slipping through her fingers. "Mr. Carter," Judge Donovan said, his voice measured but tinged with curiosity, "your ability to articulate your objections and cite precedents is unusual for someone of your age. How long have you studied law?" Ethan straightened. "Since I was 15, Your Honor. I've been preparing for this moment, and I've dedicated myself to understanding legal procedures thoroughly." The courtroom fell silent. Even Tom Reynolds, the ever-unimpressed bailiff, raised an eyebrow. The jury, who had been quietly observing, now leaned forward, their attention fixed entirely on Ethan. Margaret, regaining a hint of composure, countered, "Your Honor, while the defendant may be knowledgeable, it does not exempt him from the charges. The facts still stand." Judge Donovan nodded slowly, but his eyes never left Ethan. "Facts and procedure are both crucial, Ms. Hayes. Mr. Carter has already demonstrated that procedural errors in evidence cannot be ignored." Ethan felt a quiet surge of determination. The courtroom's energy had shifted. Where there had once been ridicule, now there was tension. Where there had been doubt, now there was curiosity, and perhaps even fear. For the first time, Ethan realized that he wasn't just defending himself, he was challenging a system that underestimated him. And if he played his cards right, the very people who mocked him could soon be forced to acknowledge his brilliance. The stage was set, and the trial was about to enter uncharted territory. Margaret Hayes could feel the pressure building. The courtroom that had once laughed at Ethan Carter now watched his every move with silent tension. Each of his arguments chipped away at the prosecution's confidence, leaving cracks that were impossible to ignore. "Your Honor," Ethan began, standing and gesturing toward a set of photographs laid out on the evidence table, "I'd like to draw attention to the inconsistencies in the timeline presented. Officer Langley's report states one sequence of events, while surveillance footage clearly shows a different sequence. This contradiction undermines the credibility of the entire case." A hush fell over the room. Even Judge Donovan, who had remained cautious throughout, leaned forward, squinting at the files Ethan highlighted. "Is this true, Miss Hayes?" he asked, his tone sharper than before. Margaret hesitated, caught off guard. "The footage—" "It could be interpreted in multiple ways, Your Honor," she stammered. Ethan's eyes locked on hers. "Your Honor, multiple interpretations are not admissible when clear discrepancies exist between documented testimony and factual evidence. These errors raise reasonable doubt that must be considered." The courtroom seemed to hold its breath. The gallery of spectators murmured, exchanging looks of disbelief. Tom Reynolds, the bailiff, shifted uncomfortably, sensing that the tide was turning. Judge Donovan's frown deepened. He rarely acknowledged a defendant in this way, and yet here he was, listening intently to a 19-year-old who was dismantling a case he had expected to be routine. Margaret's composure began to crack further. She shuffled papers frantically, her usual confidence replaced by unease. Ethan's calm, deliberate approach contrasted sharply with her faltering demeanor, making her look unprepared. For the first time in the trial, it seemed possible that the courtroom could be forced to see the truth. Ethan's meticulous preparation was paying off. He was no longer just a defendant. He was a force challenging a system that had assumed he had no power, and everyone present was beginning to realize just how underestimated he had been. Ethan Carter noticed a subtle shift in the courtroom. Even those who had doubted him before were now listening with cautious attention. The jury, silent and attentive, seemed impressed by his ability to dissect every argument with precision. Judge Donovan, who rarely showed surprise, was leaning forward, carefully considering each point. Just as Ethan was preparing his next move, a surprising voice spoke up from the gallery. It was Clara Thompson, a law clerk who had been observing the trial. "Your Honor," she said, stepping forward, "if I may. The defendant's points about procedural errors are valid according to established legal precedent." A hush fell over the courtroom. Margaret Hayes blinked, clearly caught off guard. Even Judge Donovan looked intrigued, turning his attention to Clara. "Proceed, Miss Thompson," he said. Ethan's heart raced slightly, but he stayed composed. He had hoped someone within the system would notice the cracks he was exposing, but he hadn't expected support this early. Clara's acknowledgement gave him leverage he could use. Margaret's hands trembled slightly as she interjected. "Your Honor, this does not absolve the defendant of the charges. We still have evidence." Judge Donovan raised a hand. "I am aware, Miss Hayes, but it appears Mr. Carter's objections cannot be dismissed lightly." Ethan nodded respectfully, returning to his argument with renewed confidence. With Clara's subtle support, he navigated the remaining points of contention with sharp logic, exposing inconsistencies in the prosecution's narrative that had previously gone unnoticed. The courtroom, once mocking and dismissive, was now silent in awe. Even Tom Reynolds, the stoic bailiff, appeared unsettled by Ethan's composed authority. By the time Ethan sat back down, the momentum had shifted decisively in his favor. The young man who had been underestimated, mocked and dismissed was now commanding the courtroom, and no one could ignore him anymore. Ethan knew that this unexpected ally might be the key to turning the trial completely in his favor. Ethan Carter's confidence was growing with every moment. The courtroom, which had mocked him at the start of the trial, now hung on his every word. Margaret Hayes's usual swagger had completely disappeared. She shuffled papers nervously, searching for a way to regain control, but Ethan was always one step ahead. "Your Honor," Ethan began, standing again, "I'd like to address the issue of witness credibility. Several witnesses have provided statements that contradict one another, and in one case, testimony was clearly influenced by external pressure." He pointed to the deposition records. "When testimony conflicts with documented evidence, it casts serious doubt on the prosecution's entire case." Judge Donovan leaned forward, clearly paying attention. "Are you suggesting that the prosecution's witnesses are unreliable, Mr. Carter?" "Yes, Your Honor," Ethan replied firmly. "The discrepancies are not minor, they are fundamental. They call into question the integrity of the evidence and the validity of the charges." A ripple of murmurs passed through the gallery. Spectators exchanged looks of disbelief. Tom Reynolds, the bailiff, shifted uneasily, sensing the courtroom's energy shifting. Margaret Hayes opened her mouth to respond but faltered, unable to refute the young man's precise citations and logical reasoning. Ethan continued, calmly dismantling each piece of evidence that the prosecution had relied upon. He highlighted contradictions, procedural mistakes, and overlooked facts with the accuracy of a seasoned attorney. Each point hit like a hammer, leaving cracks in the once airtight case. Judge Donovan's frown deepened as he scribbled notes, clearly forced to reconsider his earlier assumptions. The courtroom that had once doubted Ethan now realized that he was far more than a teenager defending himself. He was a formidable legal mind in disguise. By the end of his argument, silence filled the room. Margaret Hayes sat back, defeated and visibly frustrated, while Ethan returned to his seat, composed, knowing he had fundamentally changed the trajectory of the trial. The moment of reckoning was approaching, and Ethan was ready to seize it. The courtroom was tense. Ethan Carter's calm, methodical approach had completely dismantled the prosecution's case, and the air was thick with disbelief. Spectators whispered among themselves, unable to comprehend how a 19-year-old had so thoroughly exposed the flaws in a trial that had seemed hopeless. Judge Donovan, who had initially smirked at Ethan's audacity, now stared at him with a mixture of surprise and respect. He shuffled through his notes, considering every point Ethan had made, each one precise, logical, and backed by precedent. Margaret Hayes was struggling. She attempted to regain composure, speaking quickly. "Your Honor, the defendant may have raised procedural questions, but the facts remain. The evidence still points clearly to guilt." Judge Donovan raised a hand, cutting her off. "Ms. Hayes, the court acknowledges the evidence, but Mr. Carter has raised substantial doubts about its admissibility and the credibility of witnesses. These points cannot be ignored." A ripple of shock ran through the gallery. Ethan remained seated, composed, but inside he felt a surge of triumph. Every argument he had prepared, every detail he had memorized, had worked. The courtroom, which had mocked him just hours earlier, was now forced to confront the possibility that he might win. Even Tom Reynolds, the stoic bailiff, watched intently, clearly impressed. The jury members exchanged uncertain glances, some leaning forward, intrigued by the young man's extraordinary knowledge and poise. Ethan met Judge Donovan's gaze. The judge's eyes held a new understanding. He was no longer looking at a reckless teenager, but at a brilliant mind disguised as a defendant. As Margaret's frustration grew and her options dwindled, Ethan realized the tipping point had arrived. One final move could seal his victory and leave the courtroom completely stunned. The stage was set for the moment no one expected, and the courtroom would never forget it. The courtroom held its breath. Ethan Carter, just 19, had methodically dismantled the prosecution's case, exposed contradictions, and forced the judge and jury to reconsider every assumption. Now it was time for the final act, the revelation that would leave everyone in shock. Judge Donovan looked at Ethan, his expression unreadable. "Mr. Carter," he said slowly, "you've demonstrated exceptional knowledge and composure for someone your age. Before we proceed with a verdict, is there anything else you wish to present?" Ethan stood and walked confidently to the center of the room. "Yes, Your Honor. I believe it is important to disclose my background before any decision is made." He paused, letting the weight of his words settle. Though I am 19, I have been trained extensively in legal studies and litigation. I have spent years preparing for moments like this, and I am capable of representing myself effectively in court. A stunned silence filled the room. Margaret Hayes stared, speechless, her earlier confidence completely shattered. The jury exchanged looks of disbelief. Tom Reynolds, the bailiff, shook his head subtly, clearly impressed. Judge Donovan leaned back, stunned. You are telling the court that you are essentially a trained legal mind? Ethan nodded. Yes, Your Honor. I may appear young, but my knowledge and preparation are real, and I have ensured that every point I raised is valid and supported by law. The courtroom erupted into whispers. People who had doubted him now realized they had witnessed something extraordinary. A teenager had not only defended himself, but had done so with the skill of a seasoned attorney, leaving everyone, including the judge, speechless. Margaret Hayes lowered her head, defeated, while Judge Donovan quietly adjusted his notes, acknowledging Ethan's brilliance. What had started as a case stacked against him had transformed into a courtroom revelation, one that no one would forget. Ethan Carter had not just survived the trial, he had rewritten the expectations of what a young mind could achieve. The courtroom would never underestimate him again.